Well, good morning, Todd, and welcome to Meet the Candidate. I'm glad you made time on this Friday morning to get together.
Sure. Good to be here. Thank you.
Huh. Well, I'm just following up on some things that I noted in your voters pamphlet. As you know, most judicial candidates are judged by their voters pamphlet writing, and so I had a couple of questions. And one is I like to ask people about their first work experience, and I noticed that you listed a farm work on that. And what kind of farm work did you do?
Well, I'm struggling to remember if that was actually. I suppose it must have been my first farm work on the farm, but um, I grew up in the Midwest in Iowa and Illinois and Nebraska, and they have hay farms. And so back in the old days, instead of those big round bales you see in the fields, they had the small kind of rectangular bales. Well, I say small; they were anywhere from about 50 to 80 pounds, depending on how dry the hay was. And you would walk through the fields following a tractor, pulling a wagon, and throw those bales up on the wagon and stack them. And so, whether I was stacking bales on the wagon or throwing them up on there, that was one of the first things. And then the soybeans. Uh, Back then, some of the farmers didn't prefer to use pesticides, which I applaud that. But they grew weeds in their beans as well, though. So they'd have teenagers walk through the bean fields and try to cut the weeds out of them. So that was some of my early experiences for paid work.
Well, those certainly teach endurance.
Yeah.
Another question I've been asking judicial candidates is just to tell me about a book that you may have read recently, that something not for work. Although some people read so much for work, they don't like to read for pleasure, but just anything
I
come
was
to
kind of,
mind?
I was kind of looking at my bookshelf here, and I've seen I've read some interesting things. I do read so much for work that and I read periodicals,
Hmm.
the magazine and the latest updates on whether it's whatever area of law, et cetera. But um, there was an interesting book I read. Actually, it was not that recently, but within the last few years. Patrick Deneen wrote a book called "Why Liberalism Failed," and that's an interesting read. But yeah, I picked up the Federalist Papers as well recently, and used that. I don't read it, just end to end but referring to it for as a reference frequently, and I'd like to keep that handy as well.
Yeah, those looking at the original arguments of on each side for the Constitution makes it is fascinating reading.
Yeah.
You kind of connect with with real people there. Another question is about maybe a movie that has stuck with you, something that you maybe quoted your kids or.
You know, I am not much of a movie goer. I occasionally do. I'm trying to remember the last one I saw. Actually, it's been a few years. Um, no, I'm kind of a fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger, like some of the action movies or whatever kind of thing. And True Lies, I just found that really it's got the humor, the action, everything. But no, hmm, not much of a movie guy, I'll admit.
Okay. Well, I was also curious about a couple things in your bio, and one was you went from the enlisted ranks in the Navy to the to officer candidate school. What drew you to the Navy in the first place?
Well, I had enlisted in the Army as a teenager and washed out, as they say. Maybe it was administratively separated. It was an honorable discharge. Everything was cool. But I had enlisted for 4 years, and I didn't serve, 2 months hardly. And so later on, I was comparing notes with a colleague of mine at one of the firms. I shared an office with him for a year or two probably, and we were colleagues for several years. But he was a reserve officer in the Marine Corps, and so I had compared notes. He had enlisted around the same time as I had. His path took a different track, and I was somewhat reticent and regretful of not having my opportunity to serve. So I looked around at the other services, and the Navy was one opportunity. And talking to the recruiters before us, they said, "Well, you might have a better shot at the commission if you were had a record, right, an enlisted record." So I decided to go ahead. I was interested. I decided, hey, I'll enlist. if I get it, that's great. If I don't, I'll serve my enlistment, and I'm still able to have served and had the opportunity that I sought. So I went ahead and enlisted in the reserve, and as I say, over the course of my career, I went from E1. Now I was E1 in the Army. When I went into the enlisted in the Navy, I was actually at E3 and was temporarily held the rank of E5. Now I did earn the rank of E5. They had to go through qualifications and prove that you earned the rank. So I went from E1, E3 to E5 to E01 to ensign, commissioned as an ensign in the reserve as well. So it was a circuitous route, and some time passed. I was a little older than most of my counterparts as a ensign in the Navy, and even as a second class petty officer, I was a little older than most of my counterparts. But for me, it was really about that opportunity to serve and really kind of meet that kind of long standing, satisfy that regret. Not everybody does. A lot of people have regrets in life and look back at what it might have been and what they could have possibly done. And so for my case, it was really an opportunity to kind of redeem myself, if you will, in that regard, to be able to serve that career that I was, had once thought that I wanted and eventually had.
Yeah, and you served in some active duty as well, I
Yeah, that's
noticed.
right. Yeah, I was in the reserve, and after 9/11, I was called up. I 9/11 really resonated with me in a lot of ways because I had spent time in New York, not a lot, but on business. I'd been there for probably cumulatively several months over the years. But I had been at a closing for a fund that we were raising in mid 90s at the World Trade Centers.
Mm.
And so, I'd been, at the top of the mart, different things in New York, and it's such an iconic thing. And here I was, on 9/11, the morning of, I was in a office tower in downtown New Orleans, actually, where I worked, and just that thought of the vulnerability of those people and those innocent victims of 9/11. And I recall NFL professional football player Pat Tillman uh, put aside his career in the NFL, which is such a rarity that you're able to actually even land in the NFL. For football players, it's such a high honor and a mark of distinction to actually make it in the NFL. He put that aside to go, fight the war and the Army Rangers, and I really identify a lot with Pat Tillman. I couldn't really just do that because I was in the reserve already. But within a year after 9/11, I was called up. They needed three folks to go on a horse, and I said, well, if you can't find anybody else, I'll be your man. And that's all they needed to hear apparently. I was tapped for a 2-year recall, and one of the first things that I did once I was recalled up, they sent me for a temporary duty assignment in Naval Stations Roosevelt Roads, Puerto Rico.
Mm.
And interestingly, while I was there, shortly after I arrived there, actually, the a ship arrived in port, the USS Cole,
Mm.
and a lot of people, not everybody remembers USS Cole, but USS Cole was just deployed in the Persian Gulf and doing whatever. Before 9/11, there was no real hostilities. There was enforcement of the Iraqi sanctions and the no-fly zones and that type of thing. Operation Desert Fox, those things under the Clinton administration. But the Cole went into port in Yemen to refuel, and and one of the boats they thought was assisting in that was a terrorist bomber blew up inside of the ship,
Mhm.
and they had been in repairs in Newport, I believe in Newport News, Virginia, but they'd come out for sea trials, or what they call a shakedown cruise, to
Mhm.
make sure the ship was seaworthy and was capable of carrying out its naval missions. And I toured the ship when it came in, and was able to, probably one of the first non-crewmen who actually were laid put eyes on the memorial to the sailors who lost their lives in that bombing. And it really was impactful for me, that in addition to the entire circumstances of 9/11 and everything. And So I volunteered to extend beyond the 2 year recall and ended up serving almost 11 years on active duty from the time I left civilian life in 2002
Hmm.
till I separated from the active duty Navy. And then I reverted back to the reserves and I retired in 2018 from the Navy. So
Hmm.
it was unusual career
It is an unusual career path.
kind of came in the side door and up the house pipe and whatever else. It was highly unusual.
Well, there was one other thing in your voters pamphlet bio that I looked up, which was you had mentioned that you'd also served as an arbitrator for FINRA. Well, I had to look up FINRA and see what that was, but what caught my eye was serving as an arbitrator. I've done some alternative dispute resolution in my career as an architect, and so I understand what that means to serve in that role. So I invite you to explain a little bit more, since FINRA is just one of those acronyms that you probably know off the top of your head, but everybody else doesn't.
Well, when I first affiliated, it was known as NASDAQ regulation or NASDAQ regulatory dispute resolution. And then they were merged or subsumed or converted into the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. And so most folks may not really pay much mind, but when you sign a brokerage agreement, typically there's a clause in there in the fine print that most people just gloss over, for example, but an arbitration clause. So if they've got a dispute against the firm, their brokerage or the custodian of their assets, then they're not able to go into court and sue because they've obligated themselves to the arbitration clause. And so any suit against the brokerage firm goes to arbitration. And FINRA has a pool or panel of neutral arbitrators, and then the parties will be presented with options to select from that pool. And so then periodically you get tapped or requested to serve on a panel, and then given a background, figure out whether you've got any conflicts or any reason why you couldn't hear it, and then if the parties select you, then you serve on a panel with two others. Typically, it's a panel of three
Mhm.
arbitrators who will hear a controversy. And ordinarily it's a fairly substantial from a monetary perspective. So I've heard millions of dollars in suits from uh, investors and customers of brokerage firms, typically, or some other party who's related in those types of transactions. And so it's essentially, as you're aware, judging on the merits and finding fact and determining the outcome of what would otherwise be a lawsuit in a court. So it's quite similar. It's kind of quasi judicial as they sometimes refer to it as. So it's certainly there are pros and cons. I mean, we have constitutional right to trials, but you can also sign away that right as in a number of things. You waive legal protections and constitutional things of that nature. And but this basically frees up the courts to handle other matters that would otherwise be before them. So it's quite similar to proceedings in a court of law.
Okay. Well, that's a good place to go to our wrap up question, which is I give it to you for your 1 to 2 minute pitch for why Todd Bloom should be the Supreme Court Justice position number 7.
Well, I think that we're really at a pivotal point in our state. The We've got a opportunity with five of the justices' positions on the ballot. Now, two of them, of course, are not are open positions, uh, and then two of the candidates have been recently appointed by the governor. The position I'm seeking, position 7, is not an open position. It's currently held by the sitting Chief Justice of Washington Supreme Court, and but I think that we have as a state have an opportunity to kind of trim our sails, so to speak, maybe alter our course a little bit in the future. But we can't do that if we don't put new people into the court. And I've had a very broad experience. I'm highly educated and have uh, undertaken a number of intellectual challenging and difficult credentials. So I think voters could have confidence that I have the competence, the character, and the skill needed to help guide the court into the future. And for those reasons, really, I'm asking the voters for their support and for their vote. And so we'll see what happens. The primary is rapidly approaching, and so we'll know
Okay.
fairly soon whether voters come along to give somebody new a shot.
Well, we'll see what happens in the primary, and I may do another round of these after the primary. We'll see how it goes. Thank you for joining me today, Todd.
Thank you.
All right.